Thank you so much for coming back to the last kind of session of the day. This has been a truly rich day. When we imagined this conversation at the start of this project, which is a collaborative effort of British Army's own think tank, Center for Stock Analysis and Conflict Research, and our fellow friends at the University of Oxford and Reuben College, the idea behind it was, look, climate change has a lot of implications for defense and security, and we need to be able to open a space for neutral conversations that takes the conversation deeper than just acknowledging the problem, but actually we need to kind of cross cement these with NGO sector, with governmental sectors, with researchers, with academics, with diplomats, with soldiers, to really respond to this together and think about what this is going to mean for the operating environment of now and in the future. And it has implications at every level of the military response to a challenge, whether it is strategic thinking, whether it is operational preparation, but even tactical questions of where we are deployed and how we fight and what kind of machines are needed and etc. So I'm really thrilled with how the conversations have gone today, because obviously defense often has an immediate workload of here and now and the challenges that are posed by that. You know, we spent the last decade pretty much looking at the question of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and we have wrapped that up in such a way, and now we're kind of talking about the peer enemies and near peer adversaries and geopolitical changes, and there's already a worrying pattern of a new nuclear arms race, and countries are increasing their defense budgets, and different countries are taking different positions. So in the middle of all of this, to raise the question of climate change as a defense and security topic that we need to engage and discuss and wrestle with might feel a bit luxurious to particularly those who are hosting key defense and foreign policy posts. And obviously for political reasons, the COP meeting and the agenda is there. But I think for those of us within the defense community, there's always going to be a tendency to focus on here and now and the challenge, which are big and huge, but not necessarily step back from it and look at the horizon and see where things are changing and what this is going to mean for us in 5 years, in 6 years, in 10 years. And this is one of these conversations. And now as we kind of bring together all these different streams of conversations we had today, we have 4 speakers with distinguished track records behind them, with different starting points and approaches to this conversation. And I hope that's going to start the process of tying in some of these and bringing it closer to home in terms of defense thinking, planning, operations, and adaptation into the century ahead of us, no matter what we think about how the politics of this works, how the activism of this works, but there is a clear defense and security mandate to engage with this and internalize this as an important aspect. And the work of General Richard Nugent in this space has been phenomenally important in taking that conversation further, particularly for British defense. I think first we're going to start in this session with Ambassador Tacan Ildem, who is retired from diplomatic service, who was a permanent representative of Turkey to NATO and OSCE. He was also NATO's former Assistant Secretary General, and he sat at the NATO experts group on the invitation of the NATO General Secretary, who produced the NATO 2030 United for a New Era report, which kind of sets the strategic outlook for NATO. And it's been really interesting, Ambassador Ildem, to really reflect on how NATO started engaging with the question of climate change increasingly, and actually started seeing this as an immediate defense and security concern for the alliance to engage and to think through. As somebody who's been at the thick of it, thinking about NATO's strategy and adaptation, what are your observations on the implications of climate change for NATO and how NATO is starting to think about this clearly?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. Let me at the outset say that I am not a subject matter expert on climate change. Nevertheless, as a world citizen, I feel the responsibility to elevate my knowledge base and understanding. And certainly during the time that I was serving at NATO, it was one of the topics in our agenda, and also during our deliberations as the independent experts group. Climate change, among others, is also presenting challenges for our security, requiring NATO to act. The alliance does not appear to be an appropriate venue to engage in environmental politics. Nevertheless, like other international and regional organizations, NATO can and should make a contribution in this respect. Environmental change, if we look at the historical, from a historical perspective, environmental change has historically been part of NATO's focus. In fact, for an example, in 1969, I can tell that a committee was formed, a committee on the challenges of modern society in accordance with Article 2 of the founding document, NATO's founding document, North Atlantic Treaty. And this article commits the parties to promote conditions of stability and well-being. NATO also addressed the topic in its 2010 strategic concept, which is still valid. The document outlines the key environmental and resource constraints, including climate change, that will shape the future security environment. No doubt, these are issues that have the potential to significantly affect NATO's planning and operations. At the 2012 Chicago summit, members of the alliance agreed to work on improving the energy efficiency of their military forces. And in 2014, we see NATO adopting the Green Defense Framework. As part of this framework, the alliance aspired to reduce the environmental footprint of its military operations and to invest in green technologies to improve its resilience. Now, the recent statements and documents, and you refer to one of them from NATO, show that NATO will dive deeper into this subject in the future. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who served as the United Secretary General's Special Envoy for Climate Change in the past, has stated that it is essential for NATO to more closely monitor its impact on the climate and environment and to make changes to curb climate change. This will no doubt require integrating climate change into the alliance's military planning and strategy for training armed forces. Now, Stoltenberg has pointed out that climate change will only make NATO's job harder. The alliance's troops often operate in difficult environments already, like in Afghanistan until recently, or in Iraq. And they will have to adapt to new realities influenced by climate change in order to remain effective. Stoltenberg, moreover, has called on NATO to enhance its ability to respond to natural disasters in a similar manner to how it has responded to COVID-19 pandemic, and urged members of the alliance to contribute to the objective of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It is therefore no coincidence that our group, the Independent Experts Group, dealt with this issue in length during its deliberations. And in our report, we had certain sections referring to the importance of the security implications of climate change and what NATO and allies could do. In analyzing potential threats and challenges that lie beyond the year 2030 and assessing ways for NATO to continue adapting to the evolving security environment, we came up with a number of recommendations related to security implications of climate change. If I can touch upon some of them, one was to incorporate climate change into the alliance's future strategic documents, like the strategic concept. And you may recall that the heads of state and government at their Brussels summit meeting asked the Secretary General to start the work of the updating of the strategic concept, which dates back, as I alluded to earlier, 2010. Another proposal was to enhance situational awareness across the High North and the Arctic, and developing a strategy that takes into account broader deterrence and defense plans, in part by updating the 2011 Alliance Maritime Strategy. Also to include climate change in planning on resilience and crisis management, and to revise the Green Defense Framework, which was adopted in 2014. And we also came up with an idea of establishing a center of excellence on climate change and security to share, to improve information sharing among allies. Now, the authors of the NATO Young Leaders Report, and we know that young generation, especially Generation Z, is very much interested in issues related to climate change. They laid out 3 legal bases from the North Atlantic Treaty for NATO taking climate-related action. Article 2, which aims to foster economic stability. Article 3, which commits allies to enhancing their individual and collective capacities to resist attack. In fact, it is very much an article talking about resilience. And Article 4, which calls for allies to consult with one another whenever the security of any ally is threatened. Now, the Young Leaders Group that Secretary General consulted during the reflection process recommended ways for NATO to support members of the alliance in their attempts to reduce emissions. Those include assisting allied countries in measuring the carbon emissions from their militaries, eventually encouraging them to agree to voluntary cuts, and setting green targets for defense planning, like one to create cleaner military technology and equipment. An additional recommendation involves NATO deepening cooperation with other international organizations. Now, when we look at what happened after we presented our report and now, was that in March of this year, NATO foreign ministers endorsed NATO's climate change and security agenda. And allied leaders at their summit meeting in Brussels also endorsed NATO's climate change and security action plan, which is quite an important document. So there are already important and relevant ideas that could guide NATO's work on these issues in the period ahead. And I, of course, have few suggestions to make, taking this opportunity. One is definitely for NATO and the European Union to create synergies in their work and cooperating with each other on this highly important question. And if I may, I can also suggest that NATO and the EU can perhaps establish a joint staff group to address climate change and outline common measures to combat it. NATO should launch a carbon emission reduction initiative. What do I mean by that? Allies could be asked to annually report their military carbon emissions to NATO on a long-term basis. To cut carbon emissions, the alliance should develop a living set of guidelines for net zero carbon emissions on the part of allied military forces to be implemented in the next decades. This is also in line with the ambition to reduce the carbon footprint of NATO military. NATO should also enhance public awareness of the effects of the climate change and its early warning capacity to detect and monitor them. The alliance should bring together all stakeholders, including public and private sector actors, military planners, civil society and think tanks, to reinforce and complement these initiatives. NATO certainly should routinely use artificial intelligence to detect, monitor, and analyze data on climate change. The alliance should incentivize the use of biofuels, solar energy, hydrogen fuel cells, nanotechnology for military gears and equipment, and hybrid vehicles in all military activities. NATO allies should also introduce and implement measures to reduce the carbon footprint of their forces and equipment. So not only it will be something that should guide the work at NATO headquarters, but also work at individual capitals. NATO, one last important point is NATO should also expand its structures for disaster response with a view toward the disasters that will result from climate change. And I must say that the past summer months were with extreme weather conditions, many wildfires, including those in my own country and in the southern neighborhoods. Therefore, we should advance our capacities in that respect. So these are some of the ideas that I wanted to share together with the members of this esteemed panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think it's really fascinating to observe how NATO started increasingly engaging with this at the strategic political level, and it's now working towards really tangible operational recommendations, both in terms of how the allies can manage their own CO2 emissions in military operations, but also how they can monitor and respond together. I think the point you made about the fires in the Mediterranean this summer, not just in Turkey and Greece, we have seen in Spain and France and Italy, I think is a great reflection of how none of the NATO member states are necessarily able to respond to some of these challenges on their own. And in fact, partnerships on these issues could actually ease some of the more strategic and political tensions between members and bring us together to respond to huge challenges. And now I want to really move to the UK front of this conversation. And we're thrilled to have Brigadier John Clark, who's the head of strategy for the British Army. His military career has been really diverse. He started it as a member of the Royal Engineers in late 90s and served in all the terms in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Northern Ireland and in Cyprus. And also in his last post, he was the military, he served in No 10 as a military advisor to the Prime Minister, and he has led our contributions to the integrated review. So he's the right person, both with an engineering background, policy exposure, and also exposure to the belly of the beast, which is No 10, and how it works and how it comes up with its policies, but also as someone who's very articulate about how Army needs to transform and adapt and respond to the challenges ahead of it. Brigadier, obviously this is not an easy conversation. We're throwing a major challenge like, wow, we heard more than 10 speakers reflecting on the realities of climate change. It's clearly going to impact everything that we are operating in and everything we're responding to at the home front and globally, all the geographies the Army is currently deployed. From where you sit, what do you see as the implications and challenges brought by climate change to the Army, but also how Army needs to adapt and respond and internalize this threat and perhaps exploit the opportunities that comes with it?
Thank you, Ziya. Good afternoon, everybody. I think that, you know, and I've had the opportunity to dip in and out of a number of the panels today, and what's very clear, you know, what's very clear to defence and to the army within it is that, you know, climate change is a very serious issue and a key driver of conflict. And I know that General Nugi spoke about the direct and indirect effects of that, you know, including forest fires, heat waves, droughts, floods, water and food insecurity, human displacement, and so forth. And, you know, we understand very clearly that those environmental factors are intrinsic to human security. And what's also interesting, just reflecting on the last conversation, is that this isn't just confined to the rest of the world, as we often like to think it is. But when you think about the fires in the United States, the floods in Germany, and all of those other Mediterranean aspects that were just mentioned, you know, this is something that's here with us at home as well. So it's an issue with significant implications for defence, not least in terms of the way that it impacts on the dynamics of great power competition that we talk about quite a lot, but also the way in which it fuels extremism and so forth. But as much as it's a big issue for defence, it's one that defence recognises and is seeking to resolve, or at least to wrestle with. Just a quote from the Defence Command paper that was issued earlier this year. It says, "We will be a global leader in response to the emerging geopolitical and conflict-related threats being exacerbated by climate change. Driven by an ambitious climate change and sustainability strategy, we will build on the resilience of our armed forces to more extreme weather conditions to sustain our strategic advantage and freedom of maneuver in ever more unforgiving environments. In addition, we will mitigate against the impact of our departmental carbon footprint on the climate and seize opportunities to improve the sustainability of our operations." So something that defence takes very seriously. And within defence, notwithstanding the very important contributions of the maritime environments of air, space, and cyber, the army has a leading role to play, given that the people that are affected by this live on the land, which is in the environment in which we operate. And the Chief of the General Staff has been very clear about our obligation to deal with the challenge. For those of you who have been tracking through the Defence Command paper and the integrated review, our transformation programme that you referred to, Ziya, called Future Soldier. One of the things that we talk about quite a lot is, in my medical analogy of it, being about prevention rather than cure. So it's about having a more integrated expeditionary army that gets out there into the world and, you know, reassures partners and allies, deters would-be adversaries, and so forth. But the point is that it avoids, or it seeks to prevent conflict, although of course we will be ready to fight when the day comes. And I would apply exactly the same approach to the Army's tackling of climate change and sustainability. It was quite timely actually that this morning there was quite a lot in the press on something that we call Project Prometheus, which is about solar farms in order to reduce our carbon footprint, because about 60% of our emissions as an army come from our estate. And this morning we launched one of the first of 4 pilot projects to establish those solar farms. You know, a significant investment, £200 million over 10 years, 80 sites. And noting also that, as highlighted by a report by Oxford Economics in 2019, the Army in the UK oversees as much real estate as the National Trust, which is quite significant. So we're very clear on our responsibilities. But to your questions here, I think the implications of this are focused on 3 areas. First of all is the impact on the areas in which we might need to operate, many of which have been touched on by previous presenters. But to echo the ambassador's observation, you know, it highlights the importance of defence intelligence, about the network of sensors, and pointing to the importance of space, the Royal Air Force in the UK's case, but the various elements of artificial intelligence and so forth that can highlight where we might need to operate. There's an impact on what we might be asked to do, particularly in terms of humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and even perhaps going as far as protecting elements of the biosphere. in our national interest. And there's also, thirdly, an impact on the way in how we operate, recognizing that it's the Army's unique job as part of government to focus on fighting on land. So in terms of the impacts on how we operate, I would emphasize that some of the effects that we've heard about directly affect our ability to move on the land, and actually with changing temperatures in the air, particularly as far as our helicopters go, it will have a direct impact on human performance, noting the degraded conditions under which we will operate. And I guess being very specific, the impact of climate change means there are fewer places to hide. Which is quite intrinsically important to our ability to fight. So in terms of what we're working on, one of the key things is about what we call the electrification of the battlefield in terms of our networking, but reducing our dependence on resupply. So specifically trying to reduce our fuel consumption. And we have a big project called Project Mercury, which is about that electrification of the battlefield and systems that are able to fight in that environment, with a particular emphasis on remote aerial systems and on human-machine teaming within that, which will be helpful, I think, in some of the conditions that have been described. And we're also very clear on the criticality of force sustainment, the importance of enablers, for example, engineers, logistics, medical units, and so forth. And actually the structure that we have derived as an army as a result of the integrated review is one that is much more balanced across the piece, precisely to address that particular issue. There's more to do. We need to develop better links with other government departments, non-governmental organizations, again, in a way that's come out from the previous panelists. But noting that for the first time in this country, we did an integrated review this year, not a defense and security review. And the reason that we did an integrated review was partly because we recognized that in dealing with problems around the world, we need to meld together all of the instruments of national power. But it has a direct impact on the way in which we're able to better wrestle with the climate change and sustainability issues. We are and will continue to do more to partner with industry to bring sustainable or decarbonizing technology to market. And of note, within the Army's proposition, we've got a big body of experimentation that we're bringing to bear, mainly in terms of ways of fighting, but this will form an important part of that work. We will also continue to seek to learn from others, but offer our experience and advice, particularly, I think, in this analogy of prevention rather than cure. It's in all of our interest to prevent conflict where we're able to, not least through our own efforts in decarbonisation. But I think also in terms of the way in which we think and operate, we have some advice and experience to share for better or worse. So just by way of conclusion, Ziya, ultimately the purpose of defence and the Army is to prevent conflict by being ready to fight and win. But we also recognise that we need to play our part in addressing these global challenges, including within the UK meeting the government's net zero 50 target. But we see our efforts towards climate change and sustainability as absolutely intrinsic to that. But that is a way of presenting conflict as much as developing our ability to fight and win. So that we don't see I think there are some parts of some commentary that occasionally says, well, so it's one or the other, and you can't fight properly if you're going to deal with these sorts of things. And of course, there's a slight tension, but by and large, we see a real synergy of the two. And our work, for example, to work out how we better fight and hide and move and kill is actually involves developing decarbonized and sustainable systems. So very much complementary in that regard. And in all of this, working ever more closely with other government departments, non-governmental organizations, and our partners and allies. That's all.
Thank you so much, Brigadier. I think it's quite fascinating to see how there has been a shift to recognizing that actually when we talk about hybrid and electric vehicles, we're not just talking about defense losing capabilities, but actually these do give competitive advantages. You know, you're minimizing supply chains, you're performing better, hopefully they operate cheaper and longer than my iPhone. But you know, but the cynicism that you often get in defense circles, actually it's proved to be actually this is a great opportunity. So adaptation to some of these challenges might actually bring a lot of good with it. So thank you so much for highlighting that. And I think even from your remarks, it's so clear, and for those of us in defense community and those that are analyzing these issues, the challenges posed to the UK domain itself, you know, as an island nation, right? So I spent last year, actually, I fled to a small island off the shores of Northern Ireland from London, and I lived on an island of 150 people. I'm just coming out of it to life in Northern Ireland now. But I realized how vulnerable we are as a country to actually storms, floods, and the movements of the sea. I mean, logistical complications, in floods, and so many ways the forces have been called to help. The domestic kind of civil service, civil provisions for this. So we're thrilled to have actually someone who can bridge a lot of these and reflect on what this means for defense, drawing from the kind of home domain challenges. And that's Philip Tovey, who is the head of futures in Department for Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs' Chief Scientist Office. But what makes Philip really unique in this conversation that he also served as a former Royal Marine, and who has deployed in multiple operations, including partaking in the Special Forces Support Group. So he's got quite a good kind of exposure to both policies on the future, policy preparations and responses to future challenges ahead of the United Kingdom in terms of very nitty-gritty crises on horizon, but also as someone who served in uniform in nitty-gritty context and saw our responses to it. So Philip, from your kind of experience and your starting point and look into the future, what do you see as challenges waiting defense and implications? Or is this even a good conversation to have? I mean, is defense problematizing it? Is it adding it? Are we supporting the whole government approach, or are we problematizing it?
Thanks, Ziya. It's really a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invite. And I think having a representative from DEFRA is significant, and probably having a futures representative from DEFRA signifies that actually this is an emergent nexus issue that is going to involve everybody. And so I've been reflecting on the talk actually so far, not least this panel discussion, but the ones previous. And drawing back into my experience on the ground, the things that any infateer would relate to is terrain, is water, is rivers, is trees, it's cover, as John was saying. And it's really a fundamentally different relationship to a natural environment, which I was trying to count. I don't think we've really mentioned animals, trees, rivers, very, very short on actually the natural world is something that we are inextricably infused with and operate on a very intersubjective basis with, which does strike me as one of the particular concerns as to how we might find long-term sustainable solutions for how we go forward with this. And what I try and do over the next few minutes is highlight the particular challenge of climate change as a phenomena, fold back into it the importance of the other two major elements that, whilst it might be nice to keep them separate, are inextricable, and that's biodiversity loss and species extinction and pollution. So actually we're talking about a triple threat more broadly from the environmental domain, not least climate, and lots of speakers have alluded to that, but it's worth highlighting explicitly. And then talk about a little bit the foresight to action gap and why I think that happens, before then posing some climate-induced strategic dilemmas. And I say strategic dilemmas as a particular device and explain why I think that it's important that we use those. And we'll talk through 6 or so different strategic dilemmas, which I think will kind of draw some insight into the question. So first off, we've got to understand climate change as this temporal, spatial, stratified phenomena. So happens at different times in different places at different scales. Sounds like a very obvious statement to say, but when you think about the way in which that might call to action different actors, it's not going to be unilateral across the board. So it's tempting to think that climate change as a growing the growing awareness of climate change will generate some critical mass of action, when in fact, given that it's temporally, spatially stratified with graduated effects that affect people to different degrees, and again, as the infantists or kind of people with operational experience will appreciate this, you can be 5 meters away from a major firefight and not fire around. So actually, the impacts of climate change are so graduated and stratified that we have to really consider where we might get that compulsion to act because we are on the horns of a dilemma. So the foresight to foresee these problems is a necessary but not sufficient condition for action. And I'd refer back to Jared Diamond, not least in his 2005 Collapse book, where he highlights actually societies make some disastrous decisions, and all of the things that he highlights in the failure to foresee the unfolding of our consequences, the environment suffers directly as a consequence. So he highlights a complete lack of experience. So the unprecedentedness, so the U in the tuna or the VUCA acronym, which is used of lost favour, not least seen with the 2020 forest fires, the heat dome, etc., which denied any form of previous model plausibility. So never having experienced these things before, but then false analogy as well. So perceiving the problem to be something analogous to something that has gone before. And we know that happens when we try and import climate solutions to other contexts whilst failing to appreciate the subtleties and nuances of that particular ecological niche and that social ecological dynamic as well. Also, he highlights imperceptibility, and this is a really big one. So anyone who thinks that we have I would say even half an idea of the complexities of the natural world needs to read Peter Wohlhaven's Secret Network of Nature, and to understand how wolves can reshape rivers, how earthworms can control wild boar populations, and how actually very, very, very intricate, intimate interrelations and interactions over completely different temporal horizons from milliseconds to decades, and to planetary scale effects like trees changing the rotation of the Earth, needs to question how we can fully perceive some of the effects that we might be getting ourselves into. And so to put that in a military context, and one of the things that's really surprised me is we haven't even talked about the environmental impacts of conflict, and particularly of modern warfare, which, whilst has been increasingly urbanized, if we are to see peer-on-peer conflict, state-on-state, we would see untold environmental damage to our ecosystems that are already under huge strain. And so the strategic significance that really hasn't been grounded in any strategic thought, I don't think today yet, excuse me, of some of the advances of weaponry that we might see. And so what that basically says is going to be really hard to foresee, and we won't have the necessary conditions for action. So what we need to go to are these dilemmas. And these strategic dilemmas need to be well articulated. So I define a dilemma as a scenario which seemingly presents a limited set of possibilities where each possibility represents an equally unacceptable outcome, but that the felt compulsion to act is acute and overwhelming. And so we will have all been in situations where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And that's, again, a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one, because what you also need is and you have to or else. So you need the compulsion to act. force you into some of these decisions. And I think it's until we articulate the dilemmas that we're going to have, not just the unfolding climatic conditions, we aren't going to be able to effectively create the transformation that we need to address some of these things. And so these give you scenarios, these strategic dilemmas give you scenarios of high compulsion to act, so clear and present requirement that will call on defence, its assets, its knowledge, its skills, its position in the world in terms of influence and physical presence, i.e. where it's situated. It will get called, it will have to do something. So that's what we're looking for from these kind of future environmental implications. But it's got an almost irreducible complexity. So George Eustace, Secretary of State for the Environment, recently addressed CSAO and said a wonderful line where he said, collectively, the ecosystem will always outsmart us. We are not going to be able to want to understand and comprehend the types of impacts that we will have. So that's the inherent uncertainty that we're dealing with. And you can think about that in climate planetary scale tipping points, which has got some, Dr. Tim Lenton's done some amazing work on that. And we've got these kind of also the compulsion to act. And so we've got these high compulsion but irreducibly uncertain scenarios. So let me try now to articulate a few of them. So I'm going to describe some of these strategic dilemmas, roughly kind of plotted out 6. Now, these are not kind of fixed, and they're definitely not something that we are actively analysing at the moment, done for this presentation only. So in no particular order, imagine now China is seen as the provider of choice for solutions of environmental crises. China, we know, is spending upwards of £200 million on geoengineering R&D. Its partnership and slow influence in Kazakhstan region, when Kazakhstan suffers a prolonged drought, it defaults to China as its option for saviour. You then have a Chinese opportunity to experiment with legitimately, and this goes back to General Nugi's point about legitimacy and how that's different both domestically and abroad, but how other actors actually will use climate change and environmental intervention as a means to legitimize their operations. And I don't think that's really been talked about at the moment. And it's that gives us the dilemma here. So we get a deployment of cloud seeding technology in the region. We then have untold effects of that. So the uncertainty there is still really high on both sides. It's quite polarized in the field of geoengineering, but we could see effects of the Indian monsoon season causing extreme floods and droughts. We could see all sorts of other effects coming across the continent there, not least affecting the Ukrainian breadbasket and creating either drought or washout conditions and soil runoff, and deteriorating the ability of that breadbasket to produce European inflows of food. What is the type of interventions? What's the type of positioning? How would we even intervene and begin to formulate a response to that type of scenario and that type of dilemma? You have to act because the compulsion is there, not least because of the uncertainty, but the legitimacy is causing an extreme difficulty to navigate that type of scenario. So you have scenarios like that. But if I just, I'll provide one more before I stop. You can look closer to home and you can see actually the types of situations that defence might be getting involved with domestically, UK-based, around emergent eco-fascist and eco-centric food sovereignty production. So the conflict between the two, sometimes said on the left and on the alt-right, a neo-Nazi emergence of groups that are using tropes of fascist tropes to promote a rural England that actually does accord to a lot of what most of us would think are positive environmentally progressive views. However, the dark undercurrent between them is they are deeply, normally racially exclusive. They talk back to an indigenous British population, which is extremely contested and difficult to kind of define where that is, but normally a white demographic, and can constrain our ability to operate and force us to side on one particular thing. So this has been seen in the riots in France with the yellow vests, and the types of intensity of that situation where food production is the seed of the dilemma here. When you see the as possibly we might be seeing with the army drivers being used to support and mitigate the fuel crisis, defence deploying into that type of domestic situation, where on the other side you've got maybe camps like Extinction Rebellion or Earth First or PETA, etc., who have a completely different worldview, but are still targeting the need for sustainable food production domestically. That is an extremely difficult dilemma for defence to safely navigate politically, but maybe even kind of culturally for its own staff. So those are just two others that you can imagine. Militarization of the high north we've talked about, but particularly with militarized fishing fleets that we've seen China operate, permafrost melt in Siberia and the improved agricultural yields, and Russia becoming a domineering kind of global food producer. And the idea of stranded assets was mentioned earlier in relation to the current energy infrastructure. But what about stranded environmental assets? When defence, like any other major polluter, is seeking to offset, that requires land, that requires the use of land to sequester carbon. As climate change grips and we see extreme heats and wildfire, that asset itself increases your risk exposure. So you could end up in a situation where your offsetting asset doing a lot of your carbon sequestering work and your emissions mitigation is on fire and turning from a positive sequestering asset to one that's now emitting. And you've got no real good means to redress that. So those are some of the strategic dilemmas that I think we could be getting drawn into.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philip. I think your remarks have really kind of opened up that extremely fascinating and often unspoken link between the complex environmental system, our engagement with it, the shocks that it provides to us. So that's why I often think tuna was an acronym, you know, black swans we talk about. I talk a lot about pink flamingos. I mean, these are the things we know that are out there and they keep hitting us again and again and again, right? So for an environment is one of these, but also the link to human politics, how politics imagine and responds to it at the grassroots level of individuals, communities, cities, towns, but also nation states and international networks. And so I think that's why having Professor Matthew Paterson in this session is really enriching, adding and building up upon that, because as an expert who have reflected on how climate change impacts fundamentally the political institutions and structures, the questions it poses, the challenges it brings, and how political structures respond to it. And I think that is going to be a fundamental aspect of our imagination of defense policy, defense preparation, defense adaptation, because obviously defense does not happen in a vacuum, right? Defense has a national politic, defense has a policy that shapes it, grants it a particular budget, gives a particular mandate to it. And I think, as Brigadier John has mentioned, rightfully the push to integrate security and foreign policy and aid defense together was a great reflection of how a political movement can actually turn out to be really good. I mean, this is a really healthy direction to go. But other moments, it might not be so. I mean, there might be unease in defense professionals to think, are we supposed to do this kind of operation, or should we be in this space? Is it better left to civil forces or the police or DEFRA and others? So Matt, this is a huge area. And obviously, you are now entering into the most politically contentious moment of the day, not least because it's right before people's tea time. But the question of how politics interact with institutions, planning and thinking of defense, I think is an integral part of how we respond to it. And from your work, from your studies, how have you seen that shock of climate change posing continuity, discontinuity, cognitive dissonance, or adaptation into what is basically waiting ahead of us?
Okay, thank you. And thanks for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be in this panel. It's fascinating already. You've of course put right at the end, you've invited an academic to talk for only 10 minutes, which is always risky, but I'll try and be as brief as I can. As is fairly obvious from what was just said, but I'm not a security specialist. I've not been invited because I know that very much about security. I certainly have no military background, but I have been studying climate change for over 30 years and working in contexts like the IPCC and so on. And I focus mostly on questions of the global economy, which in one sense is fairly obviously the root of climate change, right? We have climate change because we have a global economy centered on fossil fuels. Right? That's the sort of crude story. It's more complex than that, as was just talked about. But I've been thinking about that for many years. The first thing I want to say in the context of this is to say that within the climate change research policy community, to my mind, there's been a really important and significant sharpening of attention in the last decade. From compared to when I was started on this in 1989. And I would frame that as be much more sharp, that we really do face quite a significant sort of stark choice between some form of large-scale societal collapse, Jared Diamond style, if you like, and certainly a very hard landing for huge swathes of humanity, let's put it that way, with huge human security costs for billions of people, or a very radical social and technical and economic transformation of basically the entirety of our infrastructure, of a sort which has never really been intentionally pursued by humanity as a whole, ever. And so on the collapse side, I think we see a few things, which is, the significantly increased assessments of the likely climate impacts of 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And given that the rough assessments are headed currently on terms of current policies to more like 3 by the end of, let's say, my daughter's life, maybe even mine. And we're also seeing actually the observations of actual climate impacts happening much more quickly than than all the models thought they were happening. Well, glaciers, loss, Arctic ice loss, extreme weather incidents, some of the things that have already been mentioned and so on. So there are no analog things like the heat dome in Pacific Northwest earlier this year. And so there's a potential also to reach 1.5 degrees much quicker than we thought, even, I would say, five years ago. The 1 point, it's been sharp, that focus has been sharpened and crystallized in a number of contexts. Perhaps the IPCC 1.5 degree report was the single most important of those, but there's actually a number of events that I think have really sharpened that perspective. And then alongside that, there's of course the recognition that actually 30 years of collective action on climate change within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or other international institutions like NATO, although, as was said, it's not central to NATO's mandate, clearly, has actually largely failed, right? There's loads of action, loads of experimentation, loads of initiatives at various scales, but the collective effort is woefully inadequate. And so collapse is some form of a really hard landing is the dominant likely outcome at the moment, right? And on the transformation side, what's happened also is that up until 10 years ago, people would be saying 70, 80% cuts in emissions, that would be great. Over possibly 40, 50, 60 years, that would be fine. And now, and what's sharpened up is now we need zero emissions. In practice, people say net zero, but in practice that means zero. And that means a sort of storyline about something like the end of fossil fuels. And that, I think, was really sharpened lots of people's minds in important ways. And I think that has implications for some of what's already been said about military operations and planning and so on. Some of those models about net zero by 2050, which is a fairly familiar storyline, are famously reliant on basically imaginary technologies to do with negative emissions that people are making it up, frankly. You know, there's a few R&D projects, but there's nothing scalable. And also a continued failure, they're also reliant on carbon capture and storage, which again has been tried for now it's 25 years since the first one was put in an oil field in Norway, and it's still massively expensive, really uncertain, lots of geology where it won't work and so on. So, and the models to get to net zero rely on those at the moment. So we are in that situation where we recognize the necessity of something much more radical than we thought was the case 10 years ago. It also means then a dramatic expansion in the range of action where we have to go, right? So with 70 or 80% cuts, really that's an energy industry issue. It's electricity production, it's transport, it's direct heat and energy use in buildings. And you can get to pretty much that with that. As soon as you get to 100, you then can't avoid thinking about aviation, cement, steel, meat and dairy, a range of other food industries, the nitrous oxide emissions in artificial fertilizers, all sorts of stuff. Nobody can sit there now, which is a standard thing for most industries or sectors, to say, oh, but we're just 2% of emissions. We don't, you know, you can leave us out. Nobody can say that anymore. And similarly, I think also we have to be, it's generating a slightly different mindset. So when I was thinking, one thing that struck me while other people were talking is that when we go to hybrid, thinking about hybrids is now basically not really the game, right? If it's not guided by how do we get, will this get us to zero? It's sort of, from that point of view, it's sort of not part of the story. It's not, it doesn't really make any sense. So it's got, it really, you know, it's a radical shift. So I think that's the first point to make, right? So I think then it's worth thinking about what does it mean to think about that sort of decarbonisation as an economic transformation. And so the first thing then is to recognise just how central and ubiquitous fossil fuels are to the way that we live. And I pick on three things. One is it's completely central to how governments make policy and how they assume the relation, you know, what the pursuit of economic growth entails. It's a really strong lockstep account about energy use and economic growth. It's also really central to some of the most, you know, the largest corporations. It's still central to that. Oil companies are the obvious ones, but plenty of others, high carbon industries. In the military context, lots and lots of arms manufacturers and military suppliers will be very high carbon industries. And so there's on the production side for military, that seems important to me. And those companies still, it's still okay, even in an advanced country like the UK, which has one of the strongest climate strategies in the world, whatever we think its failures might be, we still subsidize oil and gas in the North Sea more than we subsidize renewable energy, or depending on how you count it, that claim can be made. And the third aspect of that is it's also central to daily life and culture, right? So it's not just a question of big companies you have to cajole and regulate. It's also about how we live our day, how we move around, how we cook, what we eat, how we heat our homes and the buildings we work in, and so on. And so it's quite deep, you know, habits that have to be changed. And that's contested. Gilets jaunes that was mentioned earlier is one of it, can be read that way as well. And the final point, the second point to make about decarbonisation, if you think about the transition to a high carbon world, that was extraordinarily violent, right? The use of military power was really, really important. I'm about a kilometre south of where the Peterloo massacre took place in Manchester in 1819. And that was about control over who gets to benefit from the creation of a world centred on coal. And so that industrial transformation was really contested. And even without the violence, I think we can see how when we get sort of relatively unjust forms of transformation, the Gilets jaunes is a good case where you will get lots and lots of blowback. So some of the dilemmas that Tovey were talking about, I think are really resonated for me in that regard. So in that basis, I would say a few things about the military, and I will absolutely say other people have got more expertise in the details than that. But one is to emphasize that the military has also been an important site of technical innovation. right? So some of the points just made about energy efficiency or renewable energy, the electrification of the battlefield, I love that phrase, right? And but the reasons why, you know, this phone and most of the people's phone has a really good battery that will last many hours, that lots of the R&D investment that is the US military over the last 30 years, right? And ditto, lots of renewable energy technologies have that military origin, which, you know, in some ways is problematic because it's driven by the military logics as much as it's driven by the net zero logics or the transformation logics. But nevertheless, that's the case. It also, however, remains the case that most military operations are extremely high carbon. And so the point that was made again on the electrification of the battlefield, the question that came to me is like, what are the limits of that? I can see that for the ground vehicles. I'm wondering about it for the helicopters and the planes. At the moment, we don't really have much idea about how to get a zero carbon plane. I mean, there's also, again, all sorts of experiments, but nothing that anybody can claim is scalable. So there's that dimension, I think, is an interesting thing to think about still. And then the third point is just to say that is about the geopolitics. Final point about geopolitics. Oops, sorry, that's not my phone. Sorry, telling me to stop. So last point. You know, we have large parts of the 20th century have been, in terms of geopolitics, have been driven by competition over energy resources. And so does that mean, does the decarbonisation mean the end of that sort of geostrategic competition? It may be so for oil, right? And so the strategic location of the Middle East in particular may change. But it's worth speculating and thinking about the geopolitics of a renewable energy economy. Central resources like lithium, copper, nickel, cadmium, tellurium, indium, neodymium, and so on, which are central to batteries and solar photovoltaics and wind energy. Where are the conflicts likely to be, and are there likely to be conflicts there? Lithium is the best known, and partly because it's the most concentrated, right? 75% of the known reserves are in either Chile or Australia. Are they going to be the new site of geostrategic competition for that reason? So I'll stop there.